I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to this episode of the China Global Podcast. On May 27th, China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea concluded their Ninth Trilateral Summit in Seoul. Leaders of the three countries resumed their highest-level annual meetings for the first time in over 4 years. At the conclusion of the meeting, they issued a joint declaration that includes 6 priority areas of cooperation, ranging from sustainable development to economic collaboration and trade. What were Beijing's interests and motivations in reviving this trilateral mechanism? To discuss China's participation in the Trilateral Summit, I'm joined by Yun Sun. Yun is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center in Washington. Great to have you again on China Global.
Thank you, Bonnie, for having me again. Happy to be here.
First, what do you think were the drivers for reestablishing this leader mechanism? It was first, just to let our listeners know, goes back to 2008. Was held 8 times during 2008 and 2019. And obviously it was suspended during COVID, but after COVID was essentially over and most things got back to normal, it has taken a bit of a period of time to revive this mechanism. So why do you think that China wanted to revive it? And do you think it was a response to some extent to what the United States is doing in strengthening its relations with Japan and Korea and forging its own trilateral mechanism?
Sure. Thank you, Bonnie. That's a great question. I feel that for this trilateral summit mechanism, even since its very beginning, the proceedings or the hosting of the meetings have been very much subject to the political climate between China and both South Korea and Japan. And at different times, this meeting was interrupted. For example, between 2016, 2017, there was no meeting. And in 2013 and 2014, there was no meeting. So just like everything else among China, Japan, and South Korea, this meeting is very much subject to the political ups and downs. When the political relationships are in trouble, we usually see difficulties in scheduling these meetings or hosting these meetings, but which actually makes this year's meeting quite interesting. Because if you look at the South Korean policy towards China under President Yoon, and if you think about, let's recall China's experience with China's policy towards the President Park Geun-hye government from 2013 to 2017, there was a strong element of punitive posture from China towards South Korea, right? When South Korea was perceived as not acting according to what China's expectations, then China during that time was very keen on punishing South Korea. And the peak of that posture was the Chinese sanction against South Korea after the deployment of the THAAD system in 2016. So if you think about that experience and think about how hardline and how punitive China was, and you look at South Korean President Yoon's current policy towards China, you would assume that China would be willing or would be interested in pursuing a much more coercive approach towards South Korea. But that's not what we're seeing, which actually makes this a quite interesting, different position compared to China's previous policy towards South Korea. So this time, as we are seeing that China does perceive that President Yoon is adopting a much more pro-US alignment strategy, but China instead has been willing to accommodate or tolerate some of these, what the Chinese say, anti-China postures of President Yoon. And the hosting of this meeting, I think, is a perfect example of how China is trying to retain some affinity from South Korea and also try to shape South Korea's strategic alignment through a more friendly posture. So this change of posture on China's part is quite obvious. In terms of Japan, China-Japan relationship has been rocky. But then again, I think China is also interested in making the relationship somewhat more stable and manageable. partially because China is under a lot of pressure in terms of the supply chain, and there are indeed things that China needs to import from both Japan and South Korea. But part of it is also to show Japan that China is still a reliable, maybe not completely reliable, but China is a somewhat reliable partner to work with in the region. And remember, we're looking at the presidential election of the United States this November. And I think in the Chinese policy community is a discussion about what a second Trump term would look like, and what would be the implication for U.S. allies in the region are very much alive. So I think the Chinese have determined that, yes, both Kishida government and President Yoon of South Korea are much more inclined to a closer alignment with the United States at this time. But China is not adopting a hardline or a punitive approach towards them. China instead is demonstrating its leadership, its willingness to accommodate, and the hosting of the leadership summit, this trilateral summit, is a very good example in that regard.
So I do want to dig in a little bit more to the Japan aspect of it. But before we talk about that, tell me and our listeners how you view the outcomes of the summit. Was it less than you expected, more than you expected? Do you think that it was easy for the three countries to come to agreement on what they agreed on? And I'm also really interested in your assessment of the prospects for the trilateral free trade agreement, which has been discussed for such a long time and reaffirmed as an objective by all three governments. But, do you really think that this is feasible?
If you look at the joint statement, the declaration coming out of the meeting, it's a long statement. It has, according to the Chinese version, that there are 38 articles of things that they agreed upon, or deliverables from the summit. But if you look for the substance, it's really hard to find. It's like, oh, we agree to work together. We agree to talk more about working together. So you're like, well, where's the meat, right? Where's the substance? What are the concrete deliverables that the three countries will be aiming for, either on trade or on supply chain or on climate change or on North Korea? That I feel that the substance is really missing in every single category, and which leads to the inevitable conclusion that the fact that the meeting happened is deliverable by itself. And China using the meeting, and actually all three countries used the meeting to demonstrate that the Trilateral Summit is still a mechanism that is alive. I think this year it also had a lot of significance for South Korea, that is trying to strike a more balanced approach toward China. I think for South Korea to be able to host this meeting in South Korea and have the Chinese premier and the Japanese prime minister attending is not a trivial diplomatic victory. So if you look for the symbolism, or more look for the poster or the format of the meeting, I think there is more in those categories compared to the substance. And the FTA the trilateral free trade agreement, that has been discussed for more than 20 rounds now, right? And every year when this negotiation happens, you hear hopes from China that, oh yeah, well, we're keeping this alive. But I'm personally quite pessimistic about the prospect of that. I think there are a lot of political frictions among the three countries. Actually, pick any two, and you can find enough political beef or political disputes between them. And the economic relationship is always going to be a victim or being affected by the political climate in the bilateral relations, and that is true between China and Japan, China, South Korea, and also true between South Korea and Japan. So I'm personally not too optimistic about this free trade zone negotiation. And one last piece on that is that remember that we are in the era of a strategic competition between U.S. and China, and both Japan and South Korea, as security allies of the United States, have agreed to a number of things in terms of the supply chain vulnerability, in terms of their trade relationship with China. I think that's in fact another reason that China has been so keen on basically pushing forward the optics of a trilateral China, Japan, South Korea cooperation. Because for China to defeat quote quote, that U.S. effort to isolate China, especially in the supply chain domain, is a stated goal. So I think China does have a keen interest in retaining some access or some ability to access the South Korean and the Japanese market and their product and technology.
The last meeting of the three countries' leaders was in Chengdu in December of 2019, and there was language in that joint statement which referred to their support for the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But in this joint statement, in the most recent meeting, there was agreement on the importance of Korean denuclearization, but the language was different. Do you think that that's significant? Is it important? Has there been any diminishment in the support of the three sides for denuclearization, or is it something like a signal that really all three sides don't think it's very possible, but they're just paying lip service to the goal? How would you interpret that?
I think it does manifest a different position the three countries, or the nuanced position the three countries have on this particular issue. And if you look at, I looked pretty closely on the Chinese wording of the joint statement. What it actually said is we iterated our individual positions on the regional peace and stability, decolonization of the Korean Peninsula, and the issue of abductee. Which is a key issue for Japan. So what we're actually saying is that, the three parties reiterated that position, but there is very little consensus in terms of what they're going to do about it. So what they actually said is we agree to continue to make positive efforts to promote a political solution process on the issue of the Korean Peninsula. So there are a lot that you can read into it, because it doesn't talk about the denuclearization of North Korea. It talks about the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And in one of the questions that you posted through email, you said, well, what has changed? Well, I would say that what has changed from the last Chengdu summit is that we now actually have a South Korean government that has been much more vocal about the potentiality of South Korea going nuclear. If most things that North Korea denuclearization seems to be a remote possibility, if a possibility at all. So if you read into the nuances of what is actually said, I agree with you. I think the wording on the denuclearization of North Korea has been much weaker in this joint statement. And I think it does reflect the different political calculations on three parties about this particular issue. I also think it's a mere reflection of the inability of the three parties to have a consensus on this. So in the end, they opted for the lowest common denominator that could keep everyone happy and still have some reference to the issue in the joint statement. And that's why we're seeing a much more diluted version of the language.
So getting back to the Japan issue, obviously there has been trade friction between China and Japan, particularly over the blanket ban on Japanese seafood imports in the wake of the release of treated radioactive wastewater from the crippled Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And that began in August of 2023. And China has opposed this very, very strongly and made it not only a bilateral issue, but really tried to make it more of a broader regional issue. And apparently Prime Minister Kishida reportedly asked Chinese Premier Li Qiang to lift the ban, but Li emphasized that China remains concerned about, of course, what it refers to as nuclear contaminated water. So do you think that there is a domestic reason why Beijing is emphasizing this issue? It seems to me that it's gotten to a point where it's almost counterproductive because Japan has gone ahead. I don't think China has actually achieved its goal of drumming up a lot of support from other countries in the region to oppose the import of seafood from from Japan or to condemn Tokyo publicly. So how do you interpret why Beijing has taken this position? And isn't it, in fact, introducing more obstacles to China normalizing and improving its relations with Japan?
Yeah, that has been a really curious question, because if you look at how China has blatantly or have so steadfastly opposing Japan's action in terms of the releasing of the Chinese call them the nuclear contaminated water, but I think the IAEA and Japan have, and a lot of other countries have a very different adjudication. If you look at how obstinate or how stubborn China has been on this issue, it almost makes you wonder, what is China trying to achieve here? Because China can, through bilateral trade sanction, block Japanese seafood, and that is a means to an end. And punishing Japanese seafood exporters is certainly not the end that China is trying to seek. So if you look at what China is trying to achieve, I think the Chinese are deliberately trying to make this an issue where it can basically beat Japan on. And this is a bilateral issue rather than a multilateral or international issue. Like you pointed out, there are not a lot of countries supporting China's position on this. So I think China is very deliberately making this issue a much bigger deal, so that China feels that it holds moral ground versus Japan. So in other bilateral issues, that China can take the higher position, or China can gain the upper hand. That Japan not only invaded the rest of Asia in the 1940s, you're also releasing nuclear contaminated water and endangering the whole world. So what ground do you have to claim international leadership? Or what ground do you have to stick your position with China in terms of the East China Sea dispute? So I think the goal is apparently not just about the Japanese seafood. I think the Japanese seafood is much lesser the priority here. The priority is if you will, a context of national will, or a context between, in the Chinese view, between China and Japan, that Japan should have no international legitimacy to claim leadership, or to claim credibility, or to claim that Japan is actually China's peer. So I have to look at the issue from the political motivation, because the economic motivation simply does not square its circle. So I think this all goes back to the bilateral dispute and the friction that China has been having with Japan, and the fact that China is trying to create more leverage, or trying to create more ammunition, if you will, to undermine Japan's position.
So we know that the United States and Korea and Japan held the first trilateral summit in the United States, and China has objected fairly strongly to this meeting, and a very lengthy joint statement, which contained quite a lot of detail about what the three countries might do going forward. And of course, at the same time, there was a bilateral summit between President Biden Xi with even more examples of stronger military cooperation going forward. Do you think that China is concerned, or how concerned do you think China is about this trilateral cooperation? Does Beijing believe that it can in some way restrain the extent to which these three countries cooperate? Is that part of its goal? And in launching or reviving this trilateral mechanism, does it think it can somehow slow down the cooperation, for example, on imposing more restrictions on technology transfer to China? Or do you think that China is not maybe quite as concerned as it professes it to be, because China sometimes takes the long view and might even think that a future leader in Korea would not be as willing to improve ties with Japan bilaterally, and might be more concerned potentially about its relationship with China? So I find that China often will wait until there's another democratic election and expect that policies will change, and doesn't necessarily have as much concern as it appears at the time. But I'm curious in your analysis.
I fully agree with you, Bonnie. You are really the top expert on this. That you know these relationships much more than anyone that I know. I think you are absolutely right. I think China is concerned. China definitely did not and does not like the outcome of the Camp David summit. And China is indeed concerned with the strengthening of the trilateral cooperation because while in the past we know that Japan and South Korea, they individually have their respective security alliances with the United States, but U.S. has had a difficult time trying to bring these two allies together to the same page because of their historical agony and also because of some of the current dispute between Japan and South Korea. So when China saw this development, well, actually, again, coming back to President Yoon, his willingness to pursue trilateral cooperation with both U.S. and Japan, it is quite a concerning sign. And some of the languages or the specific items within that trilateral statement, I think it does have a very real implications for China. And if you, I can look into the details, but I do believe that the peace and stability of Taiwan Strait was mentioned. And we are seeing Japan and South Korea making basically having stronger positions and public positions about South China Sea and China's behavior. So these are all trends that China does not prefer to see. But then the question is, what can China do about it? I think one thing that Chinese did learn from that whole sad sanction experience is that with South Korea, you can push, but you're going to hit a wall at some point, and then the continued push will backfire. And it will only push South Korea and push Japan closer to Washington, which is a goal that China does not wish to see. The Chinese priority is to remember to undermine this prospect of Asia or Northeast Asia NATO and trying to pry Japan and especially South Korea away from the U.S. orbit and try to absorb them into the Chinese orbit. So if you have that long-term agenda in mind, I think for the Chinese, the question is, well, these harsh punitive measures, is that really working in our favor? Or we should just state our opposition, make our position well known to everybody, but at the same time, wait to fight till another day. Because we all know that South Korean foreign policy is very much subject to its domestic politics, depending on whether it's a progressive or is a conservative in power. So foreign strategy could have very different directions, right? And so I think for the Chinese, the argument is that, well, by the next time that South Korea has another election, we could come back. Not all is lost. And even I think the President Park Geun-hye, her administration also showed China that even if it is a conservative government of South Korea, it still has the ability to be close to China compared to the United States. So I think the Chinese see plenty of room and future potentials to work on that relationship instead of just targeting this one trilateral statement or this trilateral development. And again, in the Chinese view, the sustainability of any progress or improvement of ties between South Korea and Japan is always subject to skepticism. So for them, that yes, here's a statement, here's what they agreed on paper, but even President Yoon will not be able to bury or eliminate the fundamental differences that are still there.
I want to pivot a little bit and talk about Russian President Putin's recent visit to Pyongyang. And China's concerns about the overall trend of the Russia-North Korea relationship. Clearly, Beijing has had the most leverage over North Korea, the closest relationship with North Korea for a long time. And we have seen pretty rapid development in Russia's relations with North Korea for their own respective interests. Obviously, Kim Jong-un is looking for more access to perhaps military technology that will enable his ICBMs, his SSBNs to be more effective. He may want other things from Russia as well. And Russia needs North Korea's ammunition support for prosecuting its war in Ukraine. So it seems that that relationship has moved pretty quickly. I was surprised that in the joint statement that the two leaders agreed on a commitment to defend each other if one or the other is attacked. North Korea, of course, has a similar clause in its treaty with China. But Chinese have told me for many years that that's not something they would necessarily execute. It was a long time ago when they agreed that they would come to North Korea's defense if attacked. So Chinese scholars have told me it would be conditional, but of course that language has never been revised. But could you tell us a little bit about what you think Beijing's concerns are about the overall Russia-North Korea relationship and how you think China is going to respond and view the recent visit by Putin and the joint statement and the overall trajectory of the relationship?
Boy, those are the key questions these days. I think for China, if China has the option, they probably would prefer for China to maintain its monopoly. Remember, China has had pretty monopolized influence over North Korea and over Russia. And then the rapprochement with warming ties between Russia and North Korea does offer each other options other than China. Although you will still have to be very qualified about that option because the role that China plays in both economies, I simply don't see that role being replaced by anyone, whether it's North Korea or Russia. North Korea does not have the market to absorb that much Russian crude oil, and nor does North Korea have the financial resources to purchase that much Russian oil. I think the Chinese so far, I believe last year, 95% of North Korea's bilateral trade is still with China. So I don't think that Russia has a very deep pocket to supply North Korea with the same economic assistance or the same economic patronage. But having said that, I think the biggest concern for China at this juncture is that both North Korea and Russia have been very unpredictable and highly manipulative. And I think Chinese would say that we have had decades of experience being manipulated by these two neighbors of ours during the Cold War, after the Cold War. So for these two countries to come together, I think for China that, yes, China does play a role that cannot be easily replaced by anybody. But these two unpredictable countries coming together could potentially produce policy outcomes that will put China in a difficult position. It's a potentiality because if I look at how this trip has transpired, I haven't been able to identify exact items where China's national interests have come under a direct and overt threat. But it does open the door to many possibilities, right? And the unpredictability is a key here. Russia is unpredictable and North Korea is unpredictable, and both countries have manipulated China again and again historically. So I don't think that Chinese would want to be in that vulnerable position ever again, especially now these two countries are coming together. Having said that, I think China also has some level of confidence that because of the important role that China plays for both countries, they would be relatively careful about what they would jointly do that would put China in an antagonist position. So there is some policy leverage, but overall, I still don't think China prefers to see the warming ties between North Korea and Russia. But also recall that Russian President Putin visited China 1 week after his re-inauguration, right? So that already said it very clearly that who is the top priority for Russia and what is the nature of the Russia-China alignment. But the interesting rumor was during that visit, there was a rumor from China that Putin actually proposed to tag along North Korea towards the end of the trip, and the Chinese did not want it.
Interesting. Well, I think that would be a really interesting relationship to watch closely. Do you think that this is something that maybe Xi Jinping is raising with Putin, or do you think that that he would not express concern directly to Putin about this?
I think it would be quite premature at this point. If he raises concern, Russia could say, concern about what? How does this affect you? Or like you probably saw that the Chinese foreign ministry made it public that, well, this is a relationship between two independent sovereign nations. And the implied message is that this is none of our business until it affects us. So I think the Chinese will have to be very clear about how this development directly affects China. And so far, there's very little. The treaties that you just mentioned is a potential sore spot because China has a mutual defense treaty with North Korea since 1961. So North Korea now has this new agreement with Russia. But if you look at the language, it's still very ambiguous. There's still a lot of caveats and conditions attached to mutual assistance. It doesn't actually say mutual military assistance or defense assistance. So it leaves a lot of ambivalence and room for interpretation. So far, I guess this is the one potential sore spot that China could have that, hey, well, you have a mutual defense with us and now you have it with somebody else. And what does that mean for us? Did you consult with us? I think that's a potential area. But then again, I don't see China actively raising this with either North Korea or Russia. Just like, well, I was asked earlier today that whether Putin had mentioned his plan with North Korea with Xi Jinping. And my bet is no. What if Xi Jinping says, no, I don't think that's a good idea? Then would Putin go ahead and still have the trip and have the treaty? Or Putin will have to reconsider? This is exactly like the Putin's trip to Beijing in February of 2022, basically 3 weeks before he started the military operation against Ukraine, that Putin would not tell the Chinese or consult the Chinese advice. What if the Chinese says, no, we don't think it's a good idea? Then that will put Putin in a difficult position. So again, coming back to the real effect, what exactly is the concern of China and how does this relationship or what was agreed upon between Putin and Kim Jong-un that affects China? I think that's the deliberations that will be had in the days to come.
Well, we've been talking with Yun Sun, who is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center. Thanks for joining us again. Great to talk to you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Anytime, whatever you need.